Hi, I'm Paul Perdue, and I am the infrastructure nerd.
And I'm Mary Jo Boyd, a legal technologist.
You know, people come and go, they change their names, they leave the firm, and I think an administrator's first instinct is to delete that user.
Wait, no. We don't
want to do that, do we?
No, that can cause all kinds of problems. We can have data file integrity check errors, we can break links to records.
And we can lose that history tracking that tells who did what on each record.
That's correct.
So there are some best practices that you can employ when a user leaves or a user changes their name that can help avoid these problems.
Can you show us how that works?
I sure can. Okay, so I mentioned that there were two different scenarios. The first one's a little easier than the other, so let's look at that first. Somebody gets married or for whatever reason decides to change their name, and that affects the username. Obviously, if their username's Sylvia and they change from Sylvia Smith to Sylvia Jones because they got married, you don't need to change the username because you're using first name. But most firms use initials or they use some sort of first letter of first name, last name sort of combination. And of course, that sort of thing does change a username. Now, not the easiest way is just not to change the username, but to simply change the user's full name as it appears in the user file. So all these things happen in system config, so I did that kind of quick. When we're back in PracticeMaster, you can be anywhere and click on the APGL, Trust, Tabs, PracticeMaster, whatever, and click on this tool icon and you get to system config. Now, if we pull up somebody's name, like Ron, somebody's user ID, you can see that here we can simply change the name. So if just the last name changed and it doesn't affect the user ID, you can just change it there. Now, even if their last name changed or their name changed and in some way it affects their username, that's still pretty easy because all you do is go into Utilities and rename a user ID. That way, anything that happens to be in the system for this old user ID will simply get renamed. When you say R. Smith is changing to R. Jones in here, and I'm not going to, well, I guess I have users in PracticeMaster, so let me get out of there. Well, I'm not going to do that. In any event, if you come into this rename user ID, it simply asks for the old name and the new name, and it just goes through and changes everything that's tagged to that user ID to a new person, new name, okay? Not a new person because really you're just changing their name, their user login. So R. Smith changes to R. Jones, you say change R. Smith to R. Jones, it goes in and finds, of course, the user ID changes to R. Jones, and every reference to that user ID in the client file or in the calendar records or anywhere simply changes to R. Jones. Now, when somebody leaves the firm, there are two things you can do. You can either reassign the user ID, which is also pretty simple. You can say, okay, George left and everything that he did is being taken over by Bob. So we're going to change the user ID. We're going to reassign all entries that say George to Bob. If it's a calendar item that was for George, it's now for Bob. If it was a client that was in some way linked to George because maybe you had user IDs to link people to those sorts of records, it's now Bob. If in the fee entry window in Tabs 3, it's keeping track of who entered something. If George entered it, it's going to be changed to the fact that Bob entered it. Now, some firms don't like to do that, even if Bob is going to take over everything that George did. Either they don't like to do it because maybe it's Bob and Sally and Bill are all three going to, in unison, take over what George did. So some of it goes to Bob and some of it goes to Sally and some of it goes to whoever else I said. That's one reason they don't just like to randomly reassign the user ID. The other reason is that they like this history. Bob did this, okay? Bob's not here anymore, but Bob did this. He was on this calendar item. He attended this deposition. He met with this client. And you can still see the historical calendar records. You can still see every historical reference to him if you look in history. Bob changed this. Bob's not here anymore, but Bob changed it. If we reassign the user ID to George, then we're simply saying that we're losing all that history of what Bob did. So that's the other reason that firms don't like to simply reassign the user ID. They'd rather track what's going on. So to do that, and here's where you can get in a lot of trouble. Let's say it's Ron that left. A lot of people want to just come in here and delete Ron. Well, if you delete Ron, everything, and I find it odd that they don't warn you. Okay, they changed that. Look at that. They didn't used to really warn you, and so therefore, that might have had to do with the fact that I'm logged into PracticeMaster as Ron as well, but I don't think it does. I think what actually happened is that they fixed it so that if you try to delete Ron and Ron's tagged to records, it's not going to let you do that. And so what you really need to do is flip these switches. He's no longer a login user. We don't want somebody logging in as Ron. And he's inactive. So when we pull down a list of users whose calendars we could look at, we don't want to see Ron's name anymore because Ron's not here. That doesn't mean that we're getting rid of the historical record of Ron. If we can still open up a calendar item and see that Ron was on it. We can still open up a record that in any way was tied to Ron, or a history that in any way was tied to Ron, and see that it was Ron. This simply means, hey, don't show him in the lists when we're adding a new calendar item or that sort of thing, and don't let him log in because he's not here anymore, and we don't want somebody else logging in as him. Once you've done that, you simply create the new user. You simply add, using the blank page sort of new user icon, create a new user, and you're done, right? Wrong. Well, what about the stuff that Ron was doing that he isn't doing anymore because he's not here? That stuff needs to be reassigned. So let's get back into PracticeMaster and let's talk about that. So let's say that we have a bunch of calendar items. So I'm going to open up File, Open, Calendar. And so we've got a bunch of calendar items that may have been assigned to Ron. Now, I do have this by user. You may or may not have something like this. But the point is, you need to take some sort of a filter. That's what this really is. This is a quick view that happens to have a filter applied so that I can look at just Ron's records. Whether you create a filter, whether you get with us and have us create a filter, or whether you've already got something to use that will show you all of Ron's calendar items, that's to be decided on a firm-by-firm basis. But you need to get to where you can see all of Ron's calendar items. It's the calendar items that you're concerned with. And it's not the ones in the past, it's only the ones in the future. So you then sort by due date, and then you go to the point in time where Ron left. Let's say he left on the 27th, and you take all those items, oops, I'm hitting Control, I mean to be hitting Shift. You take all of those items that are past the date that Ron left, and you reassign them to George. How do you do that? Well, you mark them in a view. I'm in the calendar view. I'm looking at just Ron's records. I've marked the ones that are past the point that he left and not the ones that are before the point that he left. And then I can do a Control F, or I can right click and choose Find. And I'm going to replace Ron with Bob in a specific field called Group ID. So I'm going to go to Specific Field, which takes me directly into Select Fields. I clear all, and I say that I want to change, look specifically in the User Group field, okay? So what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, for all these records that are highlighted, because that's what it says, highlighted records, I want to change Ron to Bob if it appears in the User Group field. That's where you type the users or select the users for a calendar record. This effectively will take all of these items, get rid of Ron, put Bob in instead. Now, it won't work here. I'm not going to actually have it run because I don't think I have a Bob user. So obviously we need to create the user that we're moving these things to before we move them. Okay, so now we're done, right? One more thing. If Ron was a member of the group attorneys, let's say, we have to consider that any item that was set up for that group before Bob was a member of the group will not have Bob in the calendar item. Because if I create an item today for the group attorneys and Ron is a member of that group, but Bob's not, because Bob doesn't even work here yet, and I've got one item that's going to appear, next month. And tomorrow Ron leaves, and the day after we hire Bob, and I change all of Ron's calendar items that are appropriate to Bob, I have not changed those for which attorneys was the user, because remember that field said user or group. So what you also want to consider is what you're going to do with the items that may have already been created for a group that this person who's left was in and now they're not. Because those items are created on an individual basis at the time the item's created for whoever is in the group at the time the item is created. So not only consider calendar items that are going forward for Ron, who's left, to be replaced with Bob, but you also have to look at what groups Ron was in. Make sure you get Bob in that group just for the sake of consistency. And then also you need to make sure that you add Bob to any pre-existing records for that, in my example, the attorneys group, because he won't be there because they were created before he was a user. A little confusing, but let's summarize. If a user changes their name, you simply rename the user, okay? Everything flows nicely. If a user leaves, you either reassign everything using Reassign User ID, or you come in and inactivate the old user, and you should always do that anyways. Inactivate the old user, and of course you should always add the new user. Can't get them into PracticeMaster without that. And then kind of on a individual basis, you decide which calendar items get reassigned and which ones don't, and take into account the groups. Now sometimes the groups aren't an issue, and sometimes they are. So keep all those things in mind, and you will effectively move things from one person to another without breaking the system. Don't ever delete the user. You might have an older version of the software that does let you delete the user. Don't do it, okay? It will not warn you, or it did not warn you in prior versions, so don't do it. Always add the new user, inactivate the old user, and then do what you need to get stuff from one to the other, either using Reassign User ID or individually going in and finding the right calendar items and simply changing them from one user to another. So there you have it. Best practices for what to do when a user changes their name or leaves the firm.
And that's just one more way that we can help you to worry less
and practice more.